not. So let us help you understand your needs and your risks, because that's ultimately better for our business as well. So this was a bit of the process we went through with that first phase of suppliers. And then I guess this is, because I still possibly have a minute, it's really about creating a safe space. So again, it's not about, pushing responsibility down the supply chain. It's about working with your suppliers. So we try to have these conversations where we say, okay, really, what is your baseline? Where are your gaps? Let us help you. Interestingly, not many people felt comfortable, I guess, talking to those gaps up front. So it was really the conversation piece that got suppliers over the line to have, I guess, more authentic conversations. I'd probably have time to talk to this later, but I thought you always need to leave with a good take-home message, and I have, so I guess there's something that we can all do, whether you're in my role, as a human rights person doing supply chains, or as academics, or even we're all consumers. So I guess as someone who is on the fringe of practitioner, borderline interested, can't even use the word academic, but writer, shall we say. I think there's a real need for academics and industry to really partner on this stuff. So we're doing the work every day, but kind of also devoid of the frameworks that would really help place our work. So there are gaps, there's research needs. I've got a whole list if you're interested, but really looking forward to the conversation we'll have for the afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and we are interested.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here, and I'll stay sat because I'm lazy and the microphone is here. My work in supply chains has either been about what governments do, so it's been interested in public procurement and the role of government as a major procurer in changing the way that markets operate, particularly in international comparison. Or it's been about questions of related very much to kind of something I share with Debbie, which is a strategic lens on sustainability and corporate responsibility. And really it's been about, well, how do firms actually do this, and how do they advance practice in ways that mean that they do this well? And I'll say a little bit about what I mean by well, and I think that's a good conversation. And I was also struck by the social versus environmental different dimensions of sustainability, which I think is an interesting conversation point. So anyway, I'll be brief. The question I'm interested in here really is, do we, and we I think is us, but it's companies, it's society, it's government and so on, really want more sustainable supply chains? If so, why don't we have them? And I'll say a little bit about kind of what's behind that. I'll talk a bit about my work. Really, as I say, I'm an implementation guy. I'm interested in what firms do, why they do it, and what the consequences of that doing are. Right, really, that's kind of what I'm trying to kind of divine in the work that I do, and whether that's big picture policy stuff, signing up to UN and other kind of human rights, or broader commitments to bring about a better world, or whether that's kind of narrower, more specific aspects of policy commitment in organisations. I'm interested in how that follow-through happens, and how that follow-through gets derailed, and why that is. And I'll end by saying a little bit about future work. So I'll share a little of some work, limited. I get a limited amount of time to do research as a dean, but I'll say a little bit about a couple of things that we've been working on. Now, the thing that strikes me as a stylized fact, and I'll put it out there, right, and I think there's a lot, and we've heard from, I think, two clearly leading companies in terms of practice in this area. The reason I think there's a prima facie question to be asked about whether we really want sustainable supply chains is because there is so much bad news that happens in global supply chains, right? And these are three stories, I think three really interesting stories from relatively recent times. So there's one is about cobalt supply chains, can leading producers of cobalt, major ingredients for just about every electronic product, be really confident that there isn't child labour and various other nasties in the supply? No, it turns out no, they can't. There's a massive piece around military sourcing, and in particular the kind of environmental issues at the heart of military sourcing. And then there's this really interesting contemporary debate, I think, around notions of modern slavery and forced labour and so on. And the thing that strikes me right off the bat is the range of industry sectors, just how pervasive. It's not just apparel, it's not just food and agri chains. It really is kind of very, very pervasive across the industrial spectrum. And I think the amount of bad news, and you'll have a million case studies in your mind, I've got a million case studies in my mind, suggests to me that there's something systematic going wrong here, right? That we have to ask a question about why it is that, given what at least at face value is will in society and in government and in and among lead companies to have more sustainable supply chains, why is it that that seems to fall over quite so frequently and quite so badly, right? And I think you can go various ways on this, right? You can conspiracy theory number one, right? The companies don't really mean it, right? They espouse commitments that they have no fundamental intention of delivering on, right? That would be the worst case scenario, right? Classic kind of, in institutional theory land, kind of classic decoupling, the same sorts of things you'd see with greenwash and other things, right? Companies and the people who buy from the companies don't really care about any of these things, and so there's no real imperative to overcome these problems. I'll say at the outset, I don't believe that, right? I think people in companies, by and large, are well-meaning, socially engaged, good human beings. But then I think that brings about a further set of puzzles. How is it then, if they're good and they mean it, it still doesn't happen, right? And I think there are various ways of that working. One is what I'll call buyer-derailed unsustainability, right? And this is where various countervailing forces and pressures and so on in buying organisations lead to attempts to try and have more sustainable supply chains become derailed, right? So you say, well, yeah, we really want to be sustainable, but we really want low costs, we really want quick delivery times, we really want quality conditions that are met in certain ways, and so on and so forth, right? So this is we want it, but we don't want it as much as we want some of the other things. And when the chips are down and buyers are trying to meet targets for bringing down costs year on year, yada yada yada, then we end up in a difficult world. Three is kind of what I'll say a bit more about for a few minutes, and that's what I've called here supplier-derailed unsustainability. And again, I think one could view this as willful, or one could view this as a capacity gap. But here, the story is that businesses want the supply chain to become more sustainable, but actually there's just real complexity to doing that. And that's about the breadth and hierarchical depth of global supply chains. It's about their reach. It's about monitoring and control and all the complexities of those sorts of issues. And it's also to do with suppliers lacking what they need to truly meet the expectations and understand and appreciate the expectations of those buying organisations. And so what I want to get out here is that I think there's lots of different ways in which sustainability in supply chains can become derailed, and I think we need to really kind of understand the nitty-gritty of those processes in order for us then to be confident in really driving sustainable global value chains. So I'll say a little bit about one or two of the projects that I'm working on at the moment. Part of what we're trying to do in this work is to bring a supplier perspective on sustainability in global value chains, right? So instead of saying, let's look at lead buying organisations where, in a sense, lots of the action happens, lots of the policy gets created, lots of the expectations are set, let's instead flip that around, go to the, in a sense, bottom of pyramid supply chains, and let's try and understand how supplying organisations are interpreting and acting upon pressures or imperatives put upon them by often geographically distant partners in these value chains. And so this is some work I'm doing with a guy called Vivek Soundararajan at Birmingham University, where I was before I came to sunny Australia. So this is about the particular context here is the context of apparel, in particular wool supply chains in southern India, and the kind of the very small suppliers at the bottom of that kind of supply chain. What we try and do in this work by interviewing many of these suppliers and trying to understand the way in which they perceive of the requirements, demands and pressures from often, as they would frame it, Western lead buying organisations, is to try and understand how it is that you come to end up in a bad place, right? And I think there's various kind of stories here, but this is where we ended up, and you won't be able to read any of it, but I'll give you a kind of I'll give you the 5-cent version, right? This essentially the nub of the story is about a kind of social process whereby suppliers try and evaluate the underlying motivations of buying organisations and evaluate their fairness in process terms, right? So they have dynamic relationships over time, repeat business over time with suppliers, and what's going on is essentially suppliers are asking continuously questions about the attitudinal orientation of the buying organisation to them. And they'll ask questions like, do they care about me? Do they support me? Do they understand what I can and cannot do? Are they behaving procedurally and in other ways fairly? Are they doing what they say they will do in return for me doing what I say I will do, and so on and so forth? And what we perceive of here is a sense where suppliers are seeking to understand the level of commitment to the buyer relationship and to